Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Namira Islam, and I'm the Executive Director of MuslimARC. Again, thank you to our panelists and our viewers for joining us. For those watching our live stream, you can add in your thoughts and add questions for the panelists by tweeting at MuslimARC, MuslimARC, on Twitter, and by using the hashtag Solidarity. So for this month of December, MuslimARC is honoring the Islamic tradition of solidarity. Now, solidarity has a quranic basis where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in verse 971, the believers, men and women, are allies of one another. The Arabic word used for allies here, awliya, is plural for wali. Now, wali comes from the word al-wilaya, meaning the willingness to take responsibility, to manage, to be the authority, or to administer something. The early Muslim community embodied this tradition when Muslims from powerful clans protected their more vulnerable brothers and sisters in faith, particularly through the bond of brotherhood that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ established between the Ansar and the Muhajirun. So today, through this panel, we're going to explore what we can learn from the past and how we can do better in the present and build for the future in this area of intra-Muslim solidarity. So with that, let me introduce our panelists today. First, we have Dr. Ihsan Bagby. Dr. Bagby is currently the Associate Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Kentucky. He obtained his PhD in Near Eastern Studies from the University of Michigan, and his research for the decade has focused on Muslim life in America. In 2000 and 2010, Dr. Bagby conducted 2 comprehensive studies of mosques in America, which were published as The Mosque in America, A National Portrait in 2001, and The American Mosque in 2011. Dr. Bagby is also a former director of ISNA's Islamic Teaching Center from 1985 to 1991. Dr. Bagby has also been a board member for various organizations, including Muslim Alliance of North America, MANA, Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, Hartford Seminary's Hartford Institute for the Study of Religion, and the Fiqh Council of North America. Presently, he is chair of ISNA's Masjid Development Committee. Dr. Bagby converted to Islam in 1969, joining the Darul Islam movement. Next, joining us is Nawal Alhawsawi. Nawal is an activist, pilot, counselor, and founder of the Adam Foundation, an organization dedicated to challenging racism in Arab culture and all kinds of discrimination by raising awareness and continuing education. Nawal is the founder and the president of Sound Heart Institute for Mental Health Services and Training. Nawal holds a dual board license and master's in marriage and family therapy and counseling, and has worked with clients from the greater Cleveland area and treated couples and patients in rehab, in and outpatient clinics. She's a former social worker for Ohio State Children and Family Services, a former marriage and family therapist and mental health counselor for Cleveland Catholic Charities, and former addiction counselor at a Cleveland residential facility. Nawal is U.S. board certified in marital and family therapy and addiction treatment. Nawal was once dubbed the Rosa Parks of Saudi Arabia after her activism on the issue of the use of racial slurs made headlines worldwide. And last but not least, we have Dawud Walid. Dawud is the Executive Director of the Michigan chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE Michigan, a chapter of America's largest advocacy and civil liberties organizations for Muslims. He is a preacher of Islamic faith, delivering sermons at Islamic centers across America, and is a political blogger for the Detroit News. He has spoken at more than 30 institutions of higher learning about Islam and interfaith dialogue, and has also been interviewed, quoted, and published in numerous media outlets throughout the globe. Dawud served as assistant imam of Masjid Wali Muhammad in Detroit from 2001 until September 2011, while also serving as interim resident imam of the Bosnia Islamic Center in Hamtramck during the summer of 2007. So Jazakallah khair to all 3 of our panelists for being here with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Now, I mentioned verse 971 earlier, and MuslimARC, we had a hashtag conversation on this verse and what it meant to people last week. So is this a verse, this verse on the believers are allies of one another, that you actually find coming up in discussions with Muslim colleagues? And in what context, if at all, do you see this verse come up? So Dr. Bagby, I'll start with you if that's all right.
I use this verse quite a bit, and I've heard people use it often in regards to the issue of women, actually, because the verse starts at Muslimina al-mu'minina al-mu'minat, Muslim men, believers, and believing men and believing women. But also, I've used it, and I've heard it used in regards to issues of race and diversity within the Muslim community, Because it does say that all of us are awliya, ba'duhum awliya ba'd. So, and I would add that wilaya means actually a relationship of being a patron to a client. So we are to one another a patron to one another, which means we are protectors, we are ones who care for, are concerned about, who support, who defend, and as Yusuf Ali often translated, friend, which is not a very accurate translation, but friendship is part of it, part of this idea of a relationship. So nobody is a patron to one another. I mean, nobody is a patron to a client. No, we are awliya to one another. And that means we are very concerned about one another. That is our unity. So it is a very appropriate verse to the ideal we're trying to live up to, which is one community, one body that may be different in many ways, but we act as and we live as one body.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think one thing, MuslimARC, we've been talking about verse 49:13, and the idea of to know one another, that idea of friendship, genuine friendship, a back and forth relationship. Nawal, your thoughts?
Well, when we're talking, about Quranic verses, unless we're talking about specific tafsirs, usually it doesn't come up in everyday conversation, at least when I'm talking in English. It's more likely when I'm talking with the in Arabic, it's more traditional in the Arab culture. But when I thought about that verse, it kind of reminded me with another verse. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran, "You who believe, be steadfast in your devotion to God and bear witness. Bear witness." And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to, as we say in Arabic, كونوا قوامين بالحق. If you see something wrong, you have to tell the truth and not feel you're leaning to one side over the other. I feel it's related to the verse when we're talking about one community and being caring and befriending each other. Also to feel comfortable enough to tell the truth, even and stand up for justice. Even if it was against ourselves or our family or friends. So to me, it's related.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well. Dawud, what about you?
Well, I quote this verse very often as well. And in terms of this particular verse, it's very important for us to understand the context in which this surah, Surah Al-Tawbah, was revealed. The ninth surah of the Quran is not an early Medini surah. It actually came later on. So when this ayah was revealed, it was after Hijrah. It was after the brotherhood compact that was made between Muhajirin, Ansar, immigrants, and indigenous people. Some of them were non-Arabs that were paired with Arabs, for instance. And this verse came down later on, as a reminder to the believers, as far as their duties and responsibilities to each other, meaning that just because them and are paired off and live in the community doesn't necessarily mean that everything is going to be hunky-dory or that everyone is going to be getting along 100% of the time. There's not going to be conflict. Also, in this verse, al-mu'minun wal-mu'minat ba'duhum awliya'u ba'd, that one of the great mufassirin of Islam in the early generations, one of the teachers of Abu Hanifa by the name of Zayd ibn Ali ibn Hussein ibn Amir al-Mu'minin Ali, ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim, he said that what precedes in this verse actually describes characteristics of what believing men and believing women really are. So, al-mu'minun wal-mu'minatu ba'duhum awliya'u ba'din يأمرون بالمعروف وينهون عن المنكر ويقيمون الصلاة ويؤتون الزكاة ويطيعون الله ورسوله. So the first descriptions describe who really are believing men and believing women, and this wilaya that we have to each other is first that we enjoin the good and forbid the evil amongst ourselves. Then we establish prayer. Then we pay the charity, and we obey Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the other affairs. So in this wilaya that we're talking about, the first adjectives used in this ayah is relating to our mutual responsibility to each other as believing men and believing women, that we enjoin the good amongst each other and upon ourselves, and we forbid the evil amongst ourselves as believers and ourselves firstly. These are the first two adjectives.
Right. And I think that's something, you know, the next question that I have for you all is this term solidarity. What does it mean to you? And given the work that each of you have done in communities, in the masjid, you know, in organizations with Muslims, what does solidarity really mean? You know, we see that term quite a bit in activist circles that might be more secular, where it's, you know, solidarity is standing in solidarity. But in Muslim communities, what does solidarity look like? How do you think that the term is commonly used right now? How should we be thinking about it? What are some thoughts on this term, solidarity? And who would like to start with this question?
Well, I might say a few words that, you know, as Brother Dawud mentioned, that the wilaya in action is that they ya'muruna bil ma'ruf wa yanhana 'anil munkar, that they command, enjoin the good and to forbid the evil. And so we together must be active in all issues of injustice, all issues of wrong in society. So we go to the Palestinian demonstration, we give to Syria, and we join in demonstrations against, you know, Eric in New York and Mike Brown in Ferguson, Tamir Rice in Cleveland. It's not like we should divide up issues of justice. We are upholders of justice no matter what, and that is the manifestation of our solidarity.
Absolutely. The term that I mean, in terms of solidarity, one thing that we've been sort of trying to emphasize is that it's a two-way street. You don't have solidarity when it's just showing up, you know, always going to one type of protest or one type of cause, but then people not reciprocating. And I think that's one thing that we've been noticing. Dawud?
Well, you know, we are one community that's based upon Iman, but it does not mean erasure that we don't have different tribal and different national interests. And actually, this is part of the divine plan of Almighty God. And you mentioned Surah 49, Ayah 13, when He said, "Ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qaba'ila," right? That God, in His divine will, He made us to be different nations, to mean to have different political interests. There's a shab here and a shab there, right? And then He made us into different tribes, but li ta'arafu, for the purpose of us, you know, getting to know each other and getting to know each other's, you know, interests, you know, so that we can get to this solidarity. You know, our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he described the believers, the believing men and believing women, you know, as being like a building with like one part of it like shoring up or building up the other. So when I look at this term solidarity, like, yeah, we have global interests of the ummah, but then we have individual ethnic interests. In this particular circumstance, I believe that solidarity is that the affected group within the ummah, within the nation, that group has their voice centered. In other words, other people in the ummah should not feel like they have the primary responsibility to try to speak or try to dictate how the primarily affected group sees the issue. They're supposed to come and help support and stand side by side, or be slightly behind and let that group lead on that issue. Vice versa, like what the Quran says, ta'awunu ala birri wa taqwa, la ta'awunu ala ithmi wal idwan, right? That we're supposed to cooperate with each other based upon piety and righteousness. So when the other group brings forth their interests and we get to know each other, then there you have that mutual solidarity, that mutual cooperation that's going back and forth. But it's very important to understand that people's voices have to be centered And just because we're one ummah doesn't mean that other people outside of a particular national group or ethnic group have the right to trump the voices of the primarily affected group.
Absolutely. And I think when it comes to, the idea of leadership, of actual engagement with people across racial and ethnic lines, one thing is that no matter how much you try, you don't know what the lived experiences are of another individual. And, I think one thing when it comes to solidarity, the idea is that I understand just as much as you feel, or, that concept that, like, I must know exactly how it feels to be in your position. But when it comes to leadership, I mean, yeah, absolutely. Stepping aside, asking somebody else, what do you need from me right now, rather than trying to center yourself. And I think we see that quite a bit, especially in Muslim communities. I mean, we see it obviously in non-Muslim communities too, but in terms of speaking on behalf of somebody else, that idea, it's very patronizing. It's not really it's not an act of genuine friendship at all. You're trying to say that, oh, well, they must be feeling this way. Well, they can speak for themselves. And I think that's something that we've run into quite a bit. Nawal?
Well, when I think about solidarity, it really reminds me of our unity as, as human. I think about mankind. I think about unity. Solidarity means to me to break the barriers that, falsely separate us and remember our, common values as human beings. To think that solidarity, I think about when someone is hurting, I feel the pain, regardless of his nationality or race or religion. So just the unity of us as human, that's solidarity. And one thing that, and we all have prejudices and biases, and that's something comes from culture, media, whatever, the way we were brought up. But one thing that helps me to really grow my feelings and thoughts on solidarity is when I think about a group of people, I always try to think about the best person I know from that group, because sometimes it's very easy to stereotype people and generalize a negative experience with one person to cast a big, negative idea about a whole group of people. But if you really think about the best person you know from that group of people, whether it's a race or a nationality or whatever might be, it's hard to not feel solidarity. I believe every community produced great people. Every community produced role models, and I like to think about the role models and try to dwell on them, and instead of the negativity. I mean, if you think about how the media portrays us Muslims, it's kind of help us understand why, the media wants to put the Christian people on TV because it's good for the rating, but they don't really represent us, and I don't think they represent anybody that I ever met. Some of these violent things I've seen on TV. So what I hope for people when they want to feel solidarity with Muslim is to think about a really good Muslim that they've met in school or they work with, or if they never met somebody, it's time to go out and meet people. And if somebody thinks they never really met any good person from any single group or a specific group of people, maybe they're not really looking. You need to look harder, and there are great people everywhere, and I've been blessed to be able to meet wonderful people from different countries. So it helps a lot when you think about solidarity, think about the great.
Right. Now, Nawal, with your organization, I know part of the mission of the organization is to combat discrimination and, have education efforts because of some of this intra-Muslim, discrimination and prejudice. So in that work, have you noticed any trends when it comes to who is volunteering for things, good things, bad things? What have you noticed in your work?
Well, through Adam, basically started with, compacting discrimination. But then I had a paradigm shift, and I start instead of thinking about compacting just discrimination, focus on unity and communality, and also include not just racism, but all kinds of discriminations, things that we need to educate people about. Just recently, I'm not sure if you're aware, Saudi Arabia, we had a very terrible incident where a group of extremists attacked Shia Muslim in a very holy event, and they killed them. So I was part of a Mecca caravan who traveled all the way to the Eastern Province to give condolences and participate in the whole solidarity and showing support and unity. We also had a very huge event in a local huge mall in Mecca where we had hundreds of children participate. It was targeting children, and because I believe sometimes when you teach children, it's a way to teach parents indirectly. So the kids had a chance to learn about different cultures and what are the appropriate terms to refer to people who are different, not just in terms of race, but also could have physical differences, how to describe their color without using a racial slur or being offensive. So, in my way of, teaching the children, I think when they go home with this kind of message, the parents will become more conscious, and it helps sometimes to teach the kids who are really accepting and willing to learn the right thing and what to do and what not, to clear some of the things we have in the Arabic culture. We still have a lot of, words that are hurtful and discriminatory.
Absolutely. I know I've seen pictures from some of the events that you've done, and in the mall, for example, children helping with arts and crafts and things, and here in the U.S., like we've done some of that, all from Adam kind of programming, where we are talking about how to talk about skin tone and all of that. I think Dawud, your work with on Twitter calling out the use of racial slurs, I think that sort of highlighted the fact that sort of blindly believing in the youth just suddenly magically being better is not always the case. And I think that's something that sort of provided some force for us to really come together to do this work. So my next question, so since you're talking about solidarity, and especially intra-Muslim solidarity across racial and ethnic lines, I wanted to ask, what are some good examples that you've seen across, time? They might not be active now, but what are some good examples of this? And are there any coalitions that have been sustainable and have had a wider impact? Dr. Bagby, why don't we start with you?
Well, just to give maybe a big picture, I think that relations across ethnic lines, in particular across racial lines within the Muslim community, have improved so much since the time that I became Muslim. I grew up in a black community. I became Muslim in a black community, in a black Muslim organization. I mean, African American Muslim organization, not the Nation of Islam. I probably did not have a discussion with a Muslim from overseas for about 2 years after becoming Muslim. In Cleveland, at that time, a very segregated town or separated town, and Muslims lived, the Muslims from overseas lived on one side of the town, and African American Muslims lived on the other side of town. We've come a long way. We've come a long way. Things have improved so much, and because of our deen itself. I mean, our deen is very clear that separation based on race, ethnic differences, language differences have no merit in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we have the message, and I think over time we are slowly listening to that message. And I might add, to answer your question specifically, I think actually the greatest sign of our diversity and the potential of our community coming together is actually Salat al-Jumu'ah. In the Christian world, as they say, the most segregated time in America is on Sunday, when the Christians divide up. But our Jumu'ah is wonderfully diverse. in my study, that's what I do. I study masjids. I mean,
Right.
only about 4% of our masjids are one ethnic group only. In almost any masjid you go to, you will see people of different colors, different ethnic background. The problem is that we have not actualized that potential. So
Right.
people come to Juma, but they really don't get to know one another. They come and then they leave. And so we have a big challenge to actualize the potential unity that we have, and that's one of my main advocacies right now, that we try to get to know one another and use this wonderful occasion of Salatul Juma to try to build bridges between the groups. Too often people come and they leave and we don't get to know anybody.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that the 4% statistic, I'm actually quite surprised by that. It's a good thing, certainly, to hear that it's only 4% is one ethnicity. I feel like, especially in the Metro Detroit area, and Dawud, you can talk a little bit more about this, but it seems that there are very, culturally oriented masajid, where it tends to be predominantly one ethnicity. Dawud, did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, Detroit and Dearborn may be anomalies because metropolitan Detroit in general suffers from what's called hypersegregation according to sociologists. So Detroit is one of the most segregated cities in America, period, irrespective of religious difference. And because of socioeconomic factors, in part, the Muslim community, many of our mosques are predominantly, if not all, one ethnicity on Salatul Jummah. But with saying that, many of the masajid are growing in diversity. I give Khutbatul Jum'ah at a different masjid every Friday, and actually the majority of the time I'm addressing people of Arab background, and if not, then South Asian. I actually speak to congregations that are majority more Arab or South Asian, even than people who come from African American background or from West Africa. So I mean that is a sign, at least as far as the community being receptive of hearing speakers outside of their majority ethnic group, and I get respect no matter where I go at in the state of Michigan in terms of preaching the message of Islam.
Absolutely, that's great to hear, and I think that's really important. And thinking about that as well, I know I've been sort of hopping around different cities in Michigan, and the different masjids that I've been to across the state, I feel like the ones that are further away from Detroit, you do see a great amount of diversity. I remember walking in, I'll hear Bangla being spoken, but then there'll be African American, sisters there, as well as Malaysian and African immigrants, which is, all kinds of individuals. So I think that's a really good point as well. I think sometimes the outer, we talk about Muslim communities as if they're insular, but some of the demographics from the places where we live, they do impact what happens in the masjid as well. Dr. Bagby, I wanted to move to the next question that I had, which you mentioned that this, the Jummah time is such a great time where people are standing shoulder to shoulder and praying together, but then it doesn't actualize into greater, getting to know one another and all of that. My question is about missed opportunities of Muslim communities to come together, whether in the U.S. or abroad, like in Saudi Arabia, and if what are your thoughts on why we failed to create some of these sustainable coalitions? Why is it that we might come together? Is it logistical? Is it something else going on? What are your thoughts on that?
I think organizationally, very few people make this a priority. MANA under Imam Siraj started a discussion about this issue, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, And we actually started a program called Healing and Reconciliation. And alhamdulillah, it achieved some goals of bringing certain masjids together, the suburban and the inner city masjids, and that was our goal. And I think that is a good goal for any effort to try to build bridges between masjids that are predominantly one ethnic group, to bring together the suburban inner city, the black, indigenous with the masjids that are largely attended by people from overseas. But the problem, as Imam Siraj saw it, as we all saw it, is that everybody agrees with the idea, nobody makes it a priority. And somebody needs to champion this call and to basically force the agenda item. I don't think there's any resistance to this agenda item. The problem is that we don't have champions. And I hope MuslimARC takes the ball and runs with it, you know.
We're trying.
Yeah. So I'm all in favor, and we need more efforts like this to put it on towards the top of the agenda and not at the bottom of everybody's agenda.
Right. Yeah, in terms of missed opportunities and reasons why. Nawal, your thoughts?
Well, I think about what Sheikh Ibrahim Atiafa Hafidahullah said. The greatest missed opportunity for Muslim worldwide is that the refusal to accept differences in opinion. So, you know, I think we as people, we have to find the strength to allow each other to exist with our differences. You know, thinking about, you know, in America, when you go to the Arabic, maybe predominantly Arab mosque, or predominantly Pakistani mosque, as you know, there always will be someone from different background, from different race, and they're always welcome. They can pray. There is a cultural barrier, especially for first generation immigrants. They like to keep to themselves. They like to feel connected with people like them who speak their language, who have the same, you know, cultural background. So outsider who go to that mosque, they might feel like they're left out, especially if they cannot understand the language other people are communicating with. So it's not really, I would say, rejection or refusal to connect with them. It's more people seeking comfort. They're away from their homes, and they're trying to create a little community. And I think people are becoming more and more aware of that, and especially as they are able to converse more and more in English, they start to build these relationships and welcome other people who have different backgrounds and be able to form relationship. I've seen that on personal level. So I think it's okay to be different and celebrate where you came from, and at the same time accept other people. There's no contradiction.
Absolutely. Dawud?
I agree with Dr. Bagby and Sister Nawal, but I also have another caveat that I think sometimes it can just be a lack of ta'atuf or empathy that we have amongst each other. And if you can raise awareness all you want about issues, but if there's a lack of empathy, then this can lead to others' issues being dismissed. We had a Michael Brown moment here in Metropolitan Detroit around 5 years ago. That was a missed opportunity to bring solidarity. Almost 5 years ago, Imam Luqman Amin Abdullah, rahmatullahi alayhi, was shot 20 times by the FBI. We had eyewitnesses saying he was unarmed, and a large portion of the Muslim community, not only did they question us of why we defended his case, they actually started repeating some of the fallacious information that came out from the FBI, you see. But when it was the Holy Land Foundation people who were indicted and convicted, who were Palestinian, and Dr. Sami al-Arian, then they said, oh, the government, they were liars, and people coming and raising money, defend Dr. Sami al-Arian, defend the Holy Land, and they were Palestinian. But when it came to the guy who was black, you know, they automatically believe what the government said. And this goes into implicit bias or implicit racism that does exist within inside of our community. Had Imam Luqman was killed in Dearborn, had he been Yemeni or Iraqi or Palestinian, they would have been protesting all in the street in the Muslim community. So sometimes this really goes to a lack of really empathy, and that's something that's spiritual, that's something that has to be cultivated, and we have to be purified. Like, and that can only be done by instilling the Quran and the Sunnah, beginning in our youth, and reminding each other over and over and over again. I believe that when it comes to Imam Luqman, especially my community here, I believe that our community leadership has to make public tawbah. They really need to make tawbah for how that issue was completely mishandled. That was a real missed opportunity.
Absolutely, and I think that identifies, you know, three essential components. Because one, it's first the organizational structure. I mean, how do we even get people in the same room, you know, to get them from a time when they're praying next to each other to even talking? And then Nawal mentioned the language barriers and the differences in culture that even come up that prevent you from even speaking to the other person. And then even if we do have both of those in place, if there is a lack of empathy, nothing is going to happen. So I think that's a really key, you know, key part is that sometimes, and I think MSAs might be one example of this, where sometimes you do have really good diversity within the MSA. You know, you'll have different people on the board and all of that. But if you're not making a point of talking about these tensions between the individuals, you know, if we're not talking about, hey, you know, why aren't we collaborating with the Black Student Union? Why are we looking to do stuff with the Pakistani Student Union and the Arab Student Association, or with SAFE, you know, on Palestinian issues, but we have no connection with the Black Student Union? And that's something that I've, you know, heard about a number of MSAs. If we're not having that conversation, so what if we're all in the same room? So what if we're all speaking English? So I think that's a really key essential part. Right now, in terms of organizations, you know, one thing that I wanted to talk about especially is Ferguson and Eric Garner, the lack of indictments in these killings, all of that. We've been monitoring Muslim American responses to it, you know, seeing what, if scholars have been posting, if they have at all, and if so, what are they saying? What are their followers saying? When they're commenting, are they repeating the allegations that are in the media that are unfounded? Are they repeating certain narratives? One thing that I wanted to talk about was Muslims for Ferguson, which has become a little bit of an umbrella group. But, you know, are we equipped right now? Do we have umbrella organizations that are very receptive to these kind of issues? Is there a gap? You know, are current coalitions effective? If not, how can they be improved? What kind of changes should they be looking into doing? Dr. Bagby, you've, you know, obviously been working in the community for a long time, and also the study of the masjid and all of that. You know, what are your thoughts on our coalition umbrella groups?
Well, none of them are focused on this issue, and none of them are really focused heavily on the domestic issues in general, let alone the domestic issues of racism in this country. I must say we have a lot of CARE connections here on this call, and I think myself CARE is one of the best organizations that is trying to do something. Its agenda is so wide, though, it does not focus on just this one issue. I would be an advocate. I used to sit on the CARE's national board, but I definitely, if I were there, I would be an advocate for making, you know, racial issues within America one of the greater priority. But I think an effort is necessary on a national and local level. I think change is going to take place on the local level. But the national organizations need at least to endorse, and maybe that's where something MuslimARC could do to get all the national Muslim organizations and the scholars, the ulama, to maybe sign off on some statement or some initiative, and then try to implement that initiative on the local level. I think some of the best work that's being done right now in America is actually within some of the coalition organizations, the unity organizations in different areas. In Detroit, Dawud probably has his own perspective, but was it the Council of Islamic Organizations of Michigan, I think, they're trying to address the issues. Chicago, I mean, to me, the best forum for this discussion are those type of unity organizations, and most of them are fairly representative of the total Muslim community. So I think that's at least one vehicle for promoting this agenda.
Absolutely. Nawal?
Well, when I think about, coalition and organizations, I want to be really careful about not to think about something like divisive. I believe if there is an organization that says they are a Muslim organization and they want to focus on socio-political issues, that's fine. So they have their own goals that they set, so they have to focus on their goals, and that's very specific. But how to define a Muslim organization, that's where it gets tricky. We as a group, as Muslim Ummah, we are part of the group, so we don't need to have a different umbrella to go under other than being part of the Ummah. And I also think living in America, we are part of America, and today the Black community is having a discussion about what's happening in America. Some people believe what happened with Eric Garner is race, it has to do with race. Other people don't believe so. So if within the Black community, we can see that debate. I mean, I've listened to President Barack Obama, not the full interview on BET, just to part of the interview on BET, and he was talking about the progress that have been made, and how Black people need to be more patient. And I mean, there's more work to be done, but there's also progress that have been made. At the same time, I listened to Tavis Smiley, who was not very happy about that interview, and he thought that Black people are tired of waiting. So it's a conversation that goes in the country, and we're part of this country, we're part of this community, and being Muslim doesn't put us in isolation. It just, we're impacted by everyday events. When I was looking at some pictures of these protests, I saw people in hijab. I could tell some sisters wearing hijab went there. So it's nice to see that. And what I hope for the youth to focus on, make the message, especially if you want to reach the younger generation as Americans, make it more not necessarily addressing, if you're Muslim, this is what I want you to do. It's more like, as human beings, this is the right thing to do, and we want to stand for what's right. So I think it's more attractive to people of everybody, and it gets more support from people that we don't want to lose their support or alienate them, or people who are not Muslim or they don't identify as Muslim but still care deeply about these matters.
I mean, I think it's important, absolutely, to not alienate people, because if people are turned off and they're not even listening, I mean, what do you do? But at the same time, when it comes to statements of privilege, or statements of clear anti-Blackness, I think, when it comes to even when we think about Muslims just generally and Islamophobia, there's only so much we put up with. At some point you push back, and you say that this is unacceptable, and that this discourse, like, you need to take a seat. You need to take a seat and you need to listen. So I think the thinking about that, like how we do that in Muslim communities, does that work differently? How do we approach some of these instances where anti-Blackness, where privilege is being asserted in these spaces, in these Muslim spaces? How do we start talking about this, and how do we start challenging some of the damaging assumptions and statements that are being made? Dawud, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'm one of the co-founders of the Muslims for Ferguson coalition, which is also Faizan Sayed, who's a director of CARE in St. Louis, is a part of it. Mustafa Abdullah, who's an Egyptian American who works for ACLU in St. Louis. Linda Sarsour in New York is one, as well as Muhammad Malik down in Florida. And, you know, some of our organizing around this started with Ferguson, and which then led to the National Day of Action. You know, alhamdulillah, there were quite a few Muslims that came from different cities, from Dearborn to Chicago to Kansas City, who came out and joined in the solidarity efforts. And it has also helped that some prominent imams in our community have given a khutbah and used social media to talk about, from Dr. Yasser Qadi to Sheikh Mufti Suhaib Webb, you know, Imam Zaid Shakir, that have talked about this issue. But what I've also seen, and as you mentioned, Sister Namira, is that as I've refreshingly seen, especially amongst a lot of younger Muslims, and in particular Arab Americans and South Asians, you know, who are like in their college age and in their 20s, showing solidarity. I've also seen, you know, a lot of microaggression, where even people have disrespected shuyukh who've spoken in favor of Ferguson or Eric Gardner, in deploying anti-black tropes that would come from Sean Hannity or Bill O'Reilly. So, you know, it's a major issue in our community, and I think for my presence on social media, you know, I literally saw so much anti-black racism, including from some people that I knew, that I literally had to unfollow some people for my own my own mental health and well-being. Like, as the Quran says, when you see people who are just operating purely off of ignorance, like, you can't engage them at the time. وَعَدْرُ عَنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ is what the Quran says. You have to turn away and disengage people who are operating based upon ignorance and racism, and then maybe come back and engage them later. But you know, I'm pleased at some of the solidarity I've seen from Ferguson, but it's really exposed, in my mind, a level of implicit, and sometimes explicit, but a lot of implicit racism that is against Black Americans, that's really informed by the dominant culture, and particularly from white conservatism.
I mean, if I can add something, I
Yeah,
mean, I agree with
absolutely.
you,
Go ahead.
brother Dawood. Definitely, there are ignorant people. As we say in Arabic, every house has a bathroom, so you're always going to find ignorant people in every group. So it's that's a literal translation. So definitely you will meet some Arab racists, you will meet some Indo or Pakistani racists, you'll meet some
Right.
white European racists, and some African American racists. You'll always, you know how many racist joke I was, I heard by some African American that targets my ethnicity as an Arab, and to me it wasn't funny. But you know, as I said, you can see these kind of examples, and it really could be really frustrating and overwhelming. When I talk in Arabic, trying to fight racism in the Arab culture, some people might get offended, so they will try to attack me personally. I get verbal assaults, at least on a daily basis, on Twitter. But I don't focus on that. You know, I think that's part of being in the public light. You know, people gonna talk, to you, with whatever the state they're in. They're not in a good state. But I don't dwell on it. You know, the Prophet ﷺ, he's the best of all men, and during his time, there were people who were citing poetry to criticize him and mock him and make fun of him. But the companions, the Sahaba, didn't recite these poetry back. We don't know these poems. These poems are lost and forgotten, and we don't know even these poems are lost and forgotten, and we don't know even the poems or the poets. We don't know. So I think perhaps if we don't give energy and attention to people who are trying to be a distraction and have so much negative energy, and just focus on really the uplifting stories, the good stories that come out of Ferguson about the role model, the good example, the right kids who are doing the right thing. I think hopefully that will be you know, it's even good for our mental health, as you were saying. You know, it's good for our mental health to try to, you know, keep your eyes at the sunshine and you can't see the shadow.
Mm-hmm.
I think the only place where I think there's a problem, Sister Noel, is when you see people who are board of directors of masajid making these comments. When you see someone who wears an amama and gives khutbatul Jummah and he's saying this on social media, then this is where it becomes a really problematic issue, where it's not just something that is can just be say, oh well, forget about Fulan bin Fulan. It then becomes like a serious issue where you have people in leadership positions who are putting stuff on social media or commenting on pages, and they have 3,000, 4,000 people actually watching this type of nonsense, then that's where it really becomes highly problematic. I mean, I agree with you in general, but when it comes to specific individuals, it can become very problematic.
Thank you.
Dr. Bagby, any thoughts on this idea of if people, how do we address negativity? How do we address racism or anti-blackness if it's exposed? What methods should we use? How should we think about it?
Well, reacting to some of Dawud's comments, I think we need to call out people. I mean, if we're going to make this issue on the front burner, then let's put it on the front burner. And it's time to confront the stereotypes and the biases and the racism that we have in our community. So let's start a dialogue. Be polite. We're going to be polite. We're not going to call names, but let's call people out.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that we've been trying to think of is what is the other of calling out? Like, how do we as Muslims, how are we different, than maybe secular activists when it comes to calling out? One thing that I remember one of our advisors had sent us a link about this idea of calling in rather than calling out necessarily. But it obviously, again, it goes back to whether somebody wants to be there, whether they want to even consider other ideas, opposing ideas. Any other thoughts on this topic? Like, how do we move forward? Where do we go from here?
Well, I have an experience to share about calling out. There was this a person who was in leadership position when Brother Dawud was talking about people in leadership position. So he was Westernly educated. He graduated from America. I think he has an MBA or something, and he's also an author of 2 books, and he writes in different newspapers. So he tweeted calling not to call Africans to Islam and claiming that African convert through their stomach, and it's better to focus on calling American and Japanese and whatnot. So it was really one of these things that you just kind of like read and you're like, is that like a joke or what is this? So I read what he wrote, and I asked him to apologize, and he refused. He said, I don't think I said anything wrong, and I stand by my word. But the fact that I disagreed with that, and I said this is wrong, other people got involved, and there was a lot of other people on Twitter asking him to basically apologize. He refused, but what he did, he deleted his comments. So it's you can say the damage is already done, but to see the response from people, and I think I'm hoping from this, him and people unlike him, they will think twice before tweeting such level of ignorance. They will understand it's not just gonna fly. So people gonna hold it down.
And I think one important lesson with that is sometimes people don't realize it's happening, so they stay on the sidelines and they don't say anything. And then when you highlight some of these terrible, like egregious examples, people are like, wait a second, like that's, I'm going to call this out too. Like, this is unacceptable. I'm going to get off the sidelines. I'm going to say, I don't stand for this. So I think that's important as well. We do have a question from somebody who's watching. They asked that Sana Sayed, she asked, as a historical precedent, how do we see the unifying Islamic Society of America and the Muslim 10-year plan of Wali Akram? Do they hold any relevance, and can they in any way inform us today?
What organization was that?
Let's see, it was the Unifying Islamic Society of America.
I think that was an organization that existed in the 1940s.
Yeah, it
Is that
seems
what
like,
they're referring to?
I think so, yes. So their
Yeah.
question, do they hold any relevance, and can they in any way inform us today? So, going back to examples from then, do they have any relevance today?
Well, Dawud, I think, knows about this organization, but I mean, this was the first attempt of African American Sunni Muslims to unite. And there were, I think, about 15 to 20 organizations represented in their meeting in 1946 in Philadelphia that met to form this national coalition. It didn't last long, but I don't know if it's terribly relevant for our conversation, but I personally feel that this issue is best brought up and by African American Muslims, and if African American Muslims are not well organized, I think this issue will easily be on the back burner for everybody. So I think it's important that African American Muslims become more organized, and they are not very organized at that time, at this time, and therefore their interests, their points of views are not well represented in the national dialogue.
Dawud, any thoughts?
I don't have any additional comments.
Okay, and then I mean, I think that's a good point as well. I think if strengthening individual communities, I think I mean, we saw this just with the panels. We had different panels for, like, Minna Rising and being Asian Muslim. We had these panels. The one panel that got so much pushback as being divisive was the Black Muslim Future panel that we had back in July. And I think it's important when we think about strengthening individual communities, as I feel like only certain groups get that you're being divisive when you try to strengthen internally. And that's important. That's a really good point, that having the different groups being individually strengthened does not automatically make us divisive or as if we're not trying to work together. I was in Nashville about a month ago, and one thing that I thought was really interesting was that the community centers, or the masjid, like, they were very culturally split. There were different community groups, but they had umbrella organizations where the youth from the different centers would all come together, and so they weren't trying to take away from the community feel of these organizations, but then they had something umbrella where they could all come in and talk, but at the same time let the organizations be strengthened internally. So we are almost out of time. One thing that we had another question, and this one's sort of a broader theoretical question, so maybe we'll get some thoughts on this and then wrap up for the evening. How do we as Muslims intervene and destroy the system that has become part of the culture? So if we're in the United States, the system of racism shores the United States. So how do we as Muslims then come in and deal with a system that is then shaping us as well? And this is sort of a more theoretical question, but Nawal, do we want to start with you maybe?
Yeah, sure. I think it's an interesting question. America, since the beginning of this country, there's waves of immigrants who came first, and then the wave who came after, they felt the heat, and then they were discriminated against. The Catholic had to deal with it, the Italians, the Irish. So I think we the newcomers. So, I think that's part of, being here, and we can learn from the struggle of our brothers and sisters in the Black community, the African American community, how they were able to make a lot of progress in the civil rights, and also learn how the Jewish community were able to establish themselves. So just learning from other people who had to fight the same misunderstanding, discrimination, racism. When Irish people came here, some of them had to change their last name because they didn't want to be identified. Catholic were accused of being not loyal or patriotic. So it's being Muslim in America, it's comparing to other people, perhaps, maybe some people think it's still new. So we have to establish ourselves and learn from other people's struggles.
Okay. Dawud?
I think that our community needs to go through an intellectual wudu. And what I mean by this is we still underestimate like the influence of colonialism on the Muslim mind, as well as when people immigrate to America and how Americanness is pegged based upon whiteness, which is not directly related to color. We know that whiteness in America is a social construct. As Nawal mentioned, Irish weren't considered socially or politically white in America. Later on, they got their white card, like Jews, Italians, Polish, and other people. So, as far as we will work on solving our problem when we also, as an intra-Muslim community cohesion and dealing away with the racism, when we first look at and are honest about American society and whiteness, how many people in America in the Muslim community peg American success based upon whiteness, and thus the antithesis of that is blackness. And then the amount of how colonialism shapes our worldview to this day, even to the whole issue of colorism, which I know MuslimARC has dealt with, as far as people in our community still using fair and lovely and marrying because of this skin color, and oh, you better not bring home somebody that's this dark, and like all of that stuff. Like we have to have like some real talk and like really like that's why I call it mental wudu, because I don't think we fully understand how much our psyches have been affected by the centuries of colonialism, and even us black people. Like we haven't gotten through it all the way yet as far as the effects of slavery and how that damaged the psyche of black people. So it's something that we have to deal with in a very deliberate and holistic way, in my opinion.
Dr. Bagby?
Well, just to add on to Dawud's point, the reality is that the racism of America is directly tied to the colonialism in the third world, and the fight for kind of dignity, self-worth is tied also to the efforts of Muslim peoples to win their independence and their sense of pride in self. And so actually it's part of the same wave of trying to defeat the evil consequences of colonialism. I mean, black people in America are directly related to the colonial adventure, right? I mean, it's all part of the same process. Mm-hmm. But that, let me just add as we close that I think it's very important for organizations like MuslimARC to really get the national Muslim organizations to be more forthright, to embrace the idea that they, as Muslims, as obedient servants to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, understand that the fight for justice, the fight against racism in this country is part of what they do. So we need a more conscious effort. Like I said, I don't see any resistance. It's just pushing the organizations to do that. And then, my focus is really on masjids and in a relationship between masjids. And what I would love to see is, a community resource toolkit developed, show masjids who have an interest to how they can bridge the gap, build understanding. And I just give you one example. One of a sister that I think is one of the really good leaders among Muslims in this country. Some years ago she was a youngster and out of a suburban masjid, and she just we were going to a meeting with some African American Muslims, right? Inner city Muslims, and she said she was a little uncomfortable. She never had that experience, right? And I think there are people like that. There's an uncomfortability that we should be addressing. And again, I don't see the obstacles. I just see the interests. And so if we can push this agenda for the inner city masjid, the youth, to get to know the suburban masjid youth. I mean, your wonderful example in Nashville, I think you said, that's exactly the model we need to be pushing throughout America.
Right. So I think what I'll do is give you guys some time for some closing remarks. One thing that I just wanted to say, with this question, especially about justice and systems, I think a lot of people who, are attorneys, especially, you go through law school and you're very cynical because of some of, these revelations about the system and about the way this country has been structured and has been founded, on genocide of Native Americans, on slavery of African Americans, and you see that the legal system was actively helping with this. They're helping structure this. And so I think when it comes to this idea of systems, and Dr. Bagby, you mentioned as Muslims, this call for justice is what underlies everything we do. And I think as long as people just keep that target in mind, that you do whatever is just in the situation, everything else will fall into place. I don't know if necessarily we have to worry about exactly what the final system will look like, but I think just keeping an eye on justice, on what would be the just outcome in the situation. So I want to offer some time for closing remarks. Nawal, why don't we start with you?
Well, I want to close with one of my favorite verses in the Quran that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, made into nation and tribes so you may get to know one another. And I think if we act on that, try to get to know one another, that will resolve a lot of problems of misunderstanding or prejudice and biases. I encourage people to get out of their comfort zone and try to, meet a group, different ethnicity or of a different physical condition or different nationality and language. Get to know them, get to talk with them, and hopefully that will bring us together. I believe what our reality is actually is a reflection of what's inside of our heart. So if somebody is having a lot of problems and seeing a lot of problems, maybe it's time to really start with the heart and start cleaning the heart and having really good heart and thinking positive about the world and seeing the best of people.
Thank you. And Dawud?
I would just like to say, relay a tradition. Actually, it's misattributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It really comes from one of his descendants by the name of Ja'far as-Sadiq. Is narrated by Imam al-Bayhaqi about giving our brothers and sisters 70 excuses. And I think that's very important, that if we want to have healing as a community, that, when we're trying to build solidarity, or we see maybe people using racial slurs or saying things, that before we initially want to go and get ultra defensive or launch a counterattack, or even completely disengage from the person, at least try to give that person the excuse to see where they're coming from. Because I believe that in the Muslim community, as we do have some people who are like staunch racists, I think that many of the people in our community, just haven't been educated enough on this issue, and that we believe that Allah is the one who is the turner of hearts. Then if we come to people softly and sincerely, that Allah will be able to move hearts. But if we come to people aggressively and harshly without keeping this in mind, without making the excuse, then the harshness is going to turn people down, and we're not going to be able to have any ethnic and racial reconciliation to build greater solidarity. So that's, I just leave that as a reminder. Remember, 70 excuses. 70 doesn't literally mean 70. Is that when you look for an excuse and you run out, that means you keep on looking. That's what 70 really means in Arabic. The 70 is not literally 70. You keep on looking.
And Dr. Bagby, last but not least.
Well, I would like to give a shout out to MuslimARC. I think you're on to something. We have everything in our religion and our deen that supports this idea, this ideal of coming together, being one body, and we've grown so much. I mean, you'd be, I think, calling in a empty field, 30 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago. I think our community's ready, actually, now. And so this is a good timing. So I say, MuslimARC, go for it. I think you have a lot of people who would agree with you. You don't think of yourself as a minority. And so I just encourage you. My emphasis right now is on masjid development, and I think that's an arena, it's a forum in which we can do a lot of work, because that is the place where Muslims come together, and it is a place to promote this better relations and destroying racism within our own community. You know, Malcolm and, you know, me and so many people, my generation, were all children of Malcolm. And Malcolm said, you know, he's going to fight against racism in America. And Islam is a wonderful example. If y'all would look at Islam and Muslims, well, I don't know if we portray that ideal as well as we should, but that is the potential of our community. And I must say that when I have my class come to my masjid here in Lexington, Kentucky, they're always amazed at the diversity. I also go to Cincinnati, a suburban masjid, because it's a very beautiful masjid, so I take my class every year. And there's a lot of West Africans attend that masjid, the Arabs, South Asians, and so they're, again, just blown away by that diversity. They don't see that diversity in the Christian church. So we have such great potential, but it's not realized yet.
But on that note, you know, it's a very optimistic note, and it's a wonderful note to end our 2014 programming. So, you know, if for the viewers at home, you can visit us at MuslimARC.org. Jazakallah khair to our panelists. This was an amazing closing panel for MuslimARC, and again, thank you for your time. Nawal, I owe you many cups of coffee for staying up so late. Jazakallah khair to all of you, and I hope to talk more soon.
Thank you.